During the Battle of Britain, Winston Churchill gave a speech in June 1940. He said, "We shall not flag nor fail, we shall not go to the end. We shall fight in France and on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields and streets and on hills. We shall never surrender." During World War II, governments rallied all of their resources in war effort. The call to intense nationalism, as illustrated in Winston Churchill's speech in the British House of Commons, was part of a concerted policies that used all forms of communication to mobilize the population. Appeal to ideological beliefs, including fascism and communism, dominated daily life during the conflict and minimized resistance to militarism. Governments also used new military technology and tactics, including the atomic bomb and total war, disregarding previously accepted laws of war. These policies increased the level of wartime casualties. With the military in control, Japan harbored imperialistic ambitions that would lead to a world war in the Pacific. The Mukden incident and the takeover of land in Manchuria in a state called Manchukuo were early efforts in this drive. The occupation of parts of China was but one step in Japan's overall strategy, which was to create a new order in East Asia. The Japanese had looked to expand into Soviet Siberia, but when Germany and the Soviets signed the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, Japan had to look elsewhere for new territory. Nearby Southeast Asia, which was under the control of imperial powers in Western Europe and the United States, was the most obvious target. However, Japan faced obstacles. Its occupation of China led to economic sanctions by the United States. Because Japan's economy relied on oil and scrap iron from the United States, sanctions threatened to strangle its economy and undercut its military expansion. Therefore, Japan began to plan to retaliate against the United States with military force in the hope that by doing so, the Western powers would submit to Japan's imperial ambitions. Once war broke out in Europe, Hitler moved swiftly to acquire territory. He embarked on a strategy called Blitzkrieg or Lightning War to quickly subdue Poland. Germany used rapid-moving tank divisions supported by Air Force in its 4-week campaign. At the end of September 1939, Germany and the Soviets divided the country as they had planned when they signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Germany's rapid success in Poland encouraged Hitler to attack and conquer Denmark and Norway in April 1940, and the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in the following month. Germany then proceeded to bring the government and resources of the conquered nation under its control. As the Germans approached Paris, the French government fled to Bordeaux in southern France. Germany took direct control of the northern 2/3 of the country. The French set up a new pro-Nazi regime based in Vichy under Marshal Pétain, an aged World War I hero. Fearing that it would be the next victim in Germany's relentless and rapid campaign, Britain asked the United States for support. Despite a long history of isolationism from European troubles, President Roosevelt believed the United States should help the British. In 1940, the two powers signed the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, in which the United States promised delivery of 50 destroyers in exchange for 8 British air and naval bases in the Western Hemisphere. In 1941, the Lend-Lease Act, the United States gave up all pretensions of neutrality by lending war materials to Britain. Also in 1941, Britain and the United States forged a policy statement known as the Atlantic Charter, which set down basic goals for post-World War. The charter included such provisions as the restoration of self-government to those deprived of it, the abandonment of the use of force, and the disarmament of aggressor nations. In Europe, Britain was the last major holdout against Nazi power. In July 1940, Hitler ordered a large campaign against the small island nation by the German Air Force. He believed that bombardment from the air would sufficiently weaken the country so that German sea and land forces could mount a successful invasion. Initially targeting military bases in this Battle of Britain, the Germans turned to bombing British cities against the British Royal Air Force and conducted a raid on Berlin. Winston Churchill termed the Britons' finest hour as the civilian population in London and other cities withstood months of relentless bombing. The targeting of cities did provide one advantage for Britain. The British military was able to rebuild after the earlier raids on its bases. Ultimately, Britain's superior planes and radar system allowed it to destroy German planes faster than they could be replaced. By May 1941, Hitler was forced to postpone indefinitely any attempted invasion of Britain. After failing to invade Britain, Hitler turned east. He attacked the Soviet Union to eliminate Bolshevism and to create land and settlement and development for the German people. Germany's turning its focus to the east took pressure off of Britain. Germany began its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Initially, the Nazis experienced rapid success as they had in Western Europe, capturing large amounts of territory and 2 million Soviet troops. However, the German forces soon found themselves at the mercy of the harsh Russian winter. The Soviets defended the city of Leningrad in the Siege of Leningrad, which lasted 3 years and led to the deaths of millions of Soviet men, women, and children. Japan experienced rapid victories in the Pacific. It launched a surprise air attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 7, 1941, destroying much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Japan then seized the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, British Malay, Burma, and numerous Pacific islands. Japan believed that the surprise attack and the damage to the U.S. Pacific Fleet would prompt the United States to negotiate a settlement favorable to Japan immediately. Instead, U.S. isolationism disappeared overnight. Public opinion demanded retaliation against Japan. Great Britain and China joined the United States in the fight against Japanese aggression. The war truly became global when, within days, Hitler responded to the U.S. declaration of war against Japan with its own declaration of war against the United States. As the Axis powers expanded into new territory, Western colonies began to join the Allies in the war effort. For example, the Indian Army, which had started the war with only 200,000 men, ended with the war with the largest volunteer army in history, with more than 2.5 million men. Although the Indian Army sent troops to North Africa, the bulk of its troops fought against the Japanese in Southeast Asia. Like World War I, World War II was a total war. Most countries mobilized all of their resources, including civilian populations, to achieve victory. The United States started with the strongest industrial sector of any country in the world, and it added stringent government planning to provide factories what they needed. In addition, unlike anywhere in Europe, U.S. industry operated without threat of military attack. The United States ramped up production of the resources required for war, including ships, tanks, planes, landing craft, radar equipment, guns, and ammunition. With the enlistment of large numbers of men in the armed forces, women found far more opportunities to work in factories and offices. The U.S. government promoted art of Rosie the Riveter to encourage women to succeed at jobs that were once thought to be for men. Instead of mobilizing all available citizens in the war effort, German leaders relied on forced labor, some of it in concentration camps. At its peak, 20% of the wartime workforce was forced labor, with 600,000 French citizens working in German war plants and 1.5 million French soldiers working in POW camps. The solution was counterproductive, however. The workers were treated so poorly that productivity was low. In Japan, efforts on the home front were confused. The government presented an optimistic view of the war instead of trying to mobilize resources. The government took pride in not using women in the war effort, claiming the enemy was drafting women, but in Japan, out of consideration for the family system, we will not. The government was able to systematically remove children from cities to the countryside when bombing of cities started late in the war. It was also successful in rationing food throughout the war. With its entry into the war in December 1941, the United States joined other Allied powers, Great Britain and the Soviet Union. In spite of political differences, the three nations were united in their determination to achieve a military victory and agreed that Axis surrender must be unconditional. In early 1942, the Allies were struggling in Europe and North Africa. General Erwin Rommel, or the Desert Fox, led German troops in Egypt and threatened to take the northern city of Alexandria. But in the second half of 1942, the tide turned. The British defeated Rommel at the Battle of El Alamein, and after months of fighting, a Soviet counteroffensive successfully defeated the pride of Hitler's military, the German Sixth Army, in the Battle of Stalingrad. Although the Germans remained in control of most of Western Europe, the momentum of the war in Europe had turned against the Nazis. The year 1942 was also crucial in the war against Japan. The first Allied victory occurred in May in the Battle of the Coral Sea, when the U.S. Navy stopped a Japanese fleet set to invade New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, thus helping to prevent a future invasion of Australia. The following month, with the destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway Island, Allied naval forces demonstrated their superiority in the Pacific. These battles stopped the advance of the Japanese. The first major Allied offensive was on the island of Guadalcanal, which ended in early 1943 with an Allied victory. The Allied forces in the Pacific under U.S. General Douglas MacArthur used a strategy called island hopping. The Allies attacked islands where Japan was weak and skipped those where Japan was strong. The Allies slowly and at great human cost moved through the Philippines, getting closer to Japan itself. Technology was critical to Allied success. The development of fleets of aircraft carriers, ships that allowed planes to take off from and land on their decks at sea, provided air support for battleships and increased the range and flexibility of naval forces. Aircraft were used for raids on enemy ships and bases and for intelligence gathering. Submarines sank about 55% of the Japanese merchant fleet, severely damaging Japan's supply lines. The Allied successes of 1942 put the Axis powers on defensive in 1943. The Allies identified Italy as the weakest point under Axis control in Europe. In spite of German forces sent to aid Italy, the Allies gained control of the island of Sicily in July 1943, leading to the fall of Mussolini. After the Allies invaded southern Italy in September 1943, Italy turned against its former ally. After months of slow and costly progress, the Allies finally recaptured Rome on June 4, 1944. June 6, 1944 has become known as D-Day, when about 150,000 Allied forces under the command of U.S. General Dwight D. Eisenhower launched an amphibious invasion from England, landing on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. Allied casualties were high. Eventually, however, the Allies established a base to begin the march towards Paris, which was liberated in August. With control of Western Europe slipping away, Germany's defeat was drawing closer. The Germans made one final push against the Allies during the winter of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge was fought in the Ardennes forest across parts of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. An Allied victory left Germany with no realistic expectation of winning the war, yet Hitler refused to give up. Allied air raids began to systematically destroy Germany's infrastructure, and Allied troops crossed the Rhine River into Germany in March 1945. 1 month later, they were approaching Germany's capital city of Berlin. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops were also moving rapidly towards Germany. In July 1943, the largest tank battle of the war, the Battle of Kursk, was fought about 300 miles south of Moscow. The Soviets challenged this instance of German blitzkrieg by successfully holding their defensive position and then counterattacking. The Soviets then made rapid progress through the Ukraine and the Baltic states in 1944. After taking control of Warsaw, Poland in January 1945, the Soviets moved on to Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. In April 1945, they advanced on Berlin. Adolf Hitler spent the war's final days hiding in a bunker, a fortified underground shelter, in Berlin. Although the country was falling apart, he continued to live under the delusion that somehow Germany would triumph. The end came on April 30th, 1945, when Hitler committed suicide. His ally Mussolini had been killed by members of the Italian resistance 2 days before. After Hitler's death, members of Germany's high command acknowledged that continuing the war would be futile. In the first days of May, Germany surrendered to the Allies. May 8, 1945, marked the official end of the war in Europe and was designated as Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day. In early 1945, U.S. forces captured the islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima and prepared to attack the Japanese mainland. In March 1945, U.S. troops firebombed Tokyo, killing about 100,000 people and leaving about 1 million others homeless. Although the island-hopping campaign had weakened Japan's hold on the Pacific, the emperor was not ready to surrender. The United States was beginning to consider the costs of invading the Japanese homeland, which it feared might lead to enormous Allied casualties. Despite initial hesitations about using nuclear weapons, President Truman ordered the U.S. Army Air Force to drop the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. The nuclear age had begun. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, resulting in an estimated total of 140,000 Japanese civilian deaths. The months of Allied victories combined with these devastating nuclear attacks caused Japan to surrender unconditionally on August 14th. Truman designated September 2nd, the day of formal surrender ceremonies, as Victory over Japan Day, or VG Day. World War II was the bloodiest war in human history. It resulted in the deaths of around 75 million people, 2/3 of whom were civilians. It changed how people thought about racism, colonial empires, and international relations. Further, it provided the context for a fierce ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union that would shape global affairs for the following 5 decades.